Good morning. I want to invite you to join us as we read from the book of 1 Corinthians this morning. Today's passage is 1 Corinthians 6:12 through 20. I'll read the passage and then finish by saying, "This is the word of the Lord," and you can respond by saying, "Thanks be to God." Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, it is Valentine's Day on Tuesday, and it's entirely coincidental that this is the passage for today, or I should say it's God's providence, right, like we always say, that God is in control of what we're teaching, what passage comes next, and so this just happens. This is not intentional on my part. I want to make that really, really clear. But last week, we talked about God's calling for us to be pure sexually. And we saw that the Bible doesn't just give us a command to be pure, it gives us a whole lot of theology, a whole lot of reasons why we should live in our sexuality this way. And we saw Paul arguing that your body matters, that there's certain reasons, like how God's created us, that we should live in purity and pursue purity. We saw the physical body will actually be resurrected, endure to the next age, right, because of Christ's own resurrection. We're going to be made new one day. So what we do with our bodies matters a lot. This body is not just disposable. We saw that your body matters because if you're a believer in Jesus, you're united to him. You're one with him, and therefore, whatever you do, in a sense, you're bringing God into that act. And we saw that your body also has a purpose. You're made by God to be a temple of the living God. So your role in this world is to show other people who God is by proclaiming his truth and by actively following him, by denying certain things and by living in a certain way that shows that God is the one who matters the most. In other words, this call to purity is surrounded by an even greater calling, which is in every part of our lives to honor God and to show who he is. So Paul wants us to see ourselves as much more significant than how we tend to see ourselves. We're not slaves to our desires. We're not simply animals with sexual urges that have to be met. We're children of God with an unbelievable and incredible calling to change the world by his power. So the natural response of many people in hearing a message like that is to say, so is what you're saying that God hates sex? Do Christians just think that sex is gross, or does God just want us to repress our natural desires? Is Christianity just about saying no to certain desires? Are Christians people that are pleasure averse? And what we see in this passage is that that tendency, of that question is being answered and corrected. We see here that God has designed our sexuality for a good purpose, and it's not true that Christians don't appreciate pleasure or don't encourage happiness. In fact, this passage is encouraging good and consistent sexual intimacy in the life of a Christian. And this is a passage that many of you will be surprised is actually in the Bible. It's very surprising in many ways. So we're going to go through this. And by the way, if you haven't figured out already, this is one of our series of PG-13 rated sermons. So I should have said that at the beginning, but if you haven't caught on the last couple weeks, you will on this one. So I think it's great that we have people that are not married, people that are younger, but you have to use discretion with the age of your kids and their maturity. So we're going to go through this, and we're going to see the beauty of this passage, but we're also going to correct some misconceptions or some abuses that could happen in reading a passage like this. So three main things we're going to see here. The first thing is sex is not as important as you think. Sex is not as important as you think. So Paul's first going to correct this notion that we have in our culture, which idolizes and makes a god out of sexuality. Look at verse 1. This is how he starts. So again, Paul is the author of this book, this letter to the Corinthians, and he's going to correct some things that he's heard from them. So verse 1, he says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." So in my Bible, that phrase, that last sentence there is in quotes. And so this is probably the right understanding here, is that Paul is saying, you wrote to me in a previous letter about certain matters, and now I'm going to address them. So we see throughout Corinthians that he's either received word from them with questions or things they've said to him that he wants to correct or address, and also that he's received reports from different people. So Paul is kind of taking all that information and he's responding to them and helping them in different issues. And of course, for a little while here, he's been going through issues around sexuality. So what they had written to him was, they said, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Literally what they said is, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. That'd be the literal rendering of this phrase. And that word touch is rightly translated by the ESV as having sexual relations, because that idea of touch can refer in the Bible to being married or to being sexually intimate. That's how that phrase is used, sort of a euphemism for that. And so in that culture in that Greek culture, there was a tendency, as we've seen previously, there was a tendency towards kind of radical sexual expression, right? Being very free with your body, engaging in lots of sexual morality, but also there was a separate tendency toward asceticism, which would be to say it's actually good to kind of detach yourself from bodily desires entirely and to live a celibate life. Kind of like we would think of with, a monk or someone living in the desert and living this ascetic lifestyle. And so there was two different extremes here, and Paul's going to kind of correct both of those in a sense. So are they right or wrong to say it's good for a person not to get married? Well, Paul doesn't say they're wrong on this point. In fact, he seems to agree with them in the sense of the word good, right? Good just doesn't mean it's better than something else. It just means that lifestyle in and of itself is a good thing. So if you're someone who's here and you've never been married, Paul is clear you can live a good life, a great life. In fact, Paul's going to later uphold his own status as a single person and say there's a lot of freedom and a lot of opportunity to serve God through being single. In other words, in a culture that values sex so much, it might not be as important as some of us think. Paul lifts this up, and it's interesting because at this point our culture might actually agree that it's good not to be married. A lot of modern entertainment seems to downplay the beauty of marriage, right? So much of our modern movies portray being single as a life that's glorious. You have all this freedom, you can do whatever you want, and then marriage is sort of like slavery, right? And when you get married, it just sort of goes downhill, and having kids makes it even worse, and marriage is just this miserable institution. That's kind of how our world views this. And so our culture might say, yeah, it's great to be single because then you can have sex with anyone that you want to. You're totally free. You can do whatever you want. You're not tied down. It degrades the married life as dull and boring. That's the message you get in our culture. In other words, it's kind of funny, but in the pursuit of singleness, even in that pursuit of singleness, our culture actually shows how much they idolize sexuality. Right? It's easy to pursue marriage because you idolize sex, you want to have sex, but actually in our culture, even singleness is viewed in that way. Everything is about what is good for me, what will please me. So Paul is clear in this passage that he's not encouraging singleness for self-indulgence. That's not why he's encouraging this, right? He's not saying it's good to be single so that you can, go on great vacations, live this life, it's all about you, and then you can indulge in sex with whoever, whenever you want. That's not what he's saying, of course. Singleness in that mindset of indulging and avoiding responsibility is a bad thing. That's not something that Paul would encourage. What he's saying instead is singleness that commits to a celibate life that says, I'm not going to be sexually active at all. I'm going to give that up and follow God. That's a life that can glorify God in so many ways. Don't forget, Paul himself was single. Jesus himself was single. And those two guys accomplished quite a bit, right? But this is good because it reminds us that single people aren't second-class citizens compared to married people in the church. Each has an important opportunity, an important gifting from God, in a way that they can serve Him that is unique to their situation. You do not need to be married to live a fulfilled life. You don't need to be sexually active to live a fulfilled life. Sex is not as important as you might think. Your life won't be incomplete if you're not sexually active. And even to a Christian culture that should understand this, I know for me, I went to a Christian college, and it was a great college, great people. Most of my friends who've left there have done, just walking with God, living great lives, raising families, whatever. But I remember it was kind of this thing that a lot of the guys would say, and I'm embarrassed to even say it because it's ridiculous, but the guys would say sometimes, they'd say, man, I can't wait for Jesus to come back, but I just want him to wait until after I get married so I can have sex first. Which, it's like there's some things that, waiting for marriage, oh, that's great. And maybe there was somewhat of a joke there, but it was somewhat serious, right? But implicit in that comment was there's something better than being face-to-face with God, right? Than knowing God fully. And that's, of course, just a ridiculous thing to say. That's not true. And I'd even go beyond that there's no physical pleasure in life that's better than following God in everything that you do. Nothing is going to complete you in the way that will, right? Sex is not as important as you might think. And so Paul goes from that initial statement to then he gives one reason here why people should be married. Look at verse 2. He says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. That phrase, sexual immorality, is actually a plural phrase. Sexual immoralities. So the idea is there's so many temptations, so many things in this culture that have the threat of drawing people into it and destroying them, that Paul says it's a good thing to be married. It's a good thing to be married because it will protect you against these things that threaten to destroy you. Now, this is only one reason that Paul gives to get married, and it's one specific to this passage. It's not the only reason to get married, okay? Paul's not giving a comprehensive theology of marriage in this one passage, but he is saying this is one good reason why you should pursue marriage. So in other words, the norm in the Bible is marriage. As good and as great and as glorious as singleness is, the norm, the average, the kind of expected path, until proven otherwise, is marriage. This is the pattern that God has set for his people. This is kind of the norm that most people will pursue. In fact, Paul seems to have to be urging them to consider singleness in this passage as a viable alternative, to consider whether God's called them to that, to give up marriage to follow him. But marriage is the norm in Christian culture, and this is how it should be. And one of the reasons why it's a great thing is because it helps to guard against sexual temptation. That we live in a world that has so many different temptations. It wasn't just the Corinthian world that had that. So do we. And sex outside of marriage will bring with it so many problems. The obvious ones are things like a child being born that doesn't have a stable home and a mother and a father to raise him or her. There's a danger with sex outside of marriage that Christians will look just like the world, will become just like the world that we're trying to give the good news to, or that will dishonor God through our lives. So Paul wants to see people get married, have a stable home, and avoid things that could destroy them and could harm others. It's a great thing to have someone who is in that battle with you, who is helping you day by day to fight against temptation, and someone that you can direct that energy toward in a way that doesn't destroy, but actually builds up and brings life and blessing to someone else. So this is one reason why marriage is the norm for Christians. Now let me pause here, okay, and just say a few things on a practical level. And I want to speak specifically to those of you who are younger, okay? I know we got a lot of young people here, a lot of unmarried people here. And I would just say this. If you want a spouse, you should pursue a spouse. I know in our culture it's kind of weird to say. You're supposed to just kind of like not care and just kind of let it happen to you or something. But no, I think it's a great thing to say, this is what I want in my life. I want to get married, and I want to strive toward that. And then realize that if you want a spouse, you need to get serious about your life. Marriage is for adults. It's not for kids. It's not for babies. And some of you, and I say this in love, you need to strive to grow up. You need to mature. You need to take some hard things on and become a better person so you're ready when God sends that person along. Marriage is not about finding the right person. It's about being the right person to prepare for the person that God's going to bring to you. It's about working on yourself, not going out on some mystical hunt for that special someone, right? Who are you becoming? Are you becoming a better person? Are you becoming a person that when God sends that person along, you'll be ready for them? Or have you been wasting time? A few basic tips, especially for you college, young adults, because I want you to get married. I really do. And these are things in order from least important to most important, okay? This is just me loving you, okay? First thing, be physically healthy, okay? Take care of yourself. Be healthy. I see so many people, and I know our young people are cut above, okay? They are. But I see so many young men from the university who look like a strong breeze could just blow them away, right? And they've never seen the light of day before. So put down the controller, come outside, get active, get some sunlight. And I'm sorry if I'm insulting anybody. And I just want to say clearly, you don't have to be any kind of body type to be attractive. You have to be a good version of yourself, right? So be active. You're young, you should be active. You should be doing things that keep you healthy. And that should be true until you're very old, right? Be healthy, take care of yourself. Be a hard worker. Be a hard worker. No one is attracted to someone who is lazy, right? No one is attracted to someone who procrastinates constantly and wakes up at 11 a.m., right? So are you striving for excellence in school? I know I'm hitting a nerve with some people here. I'm sorry. Are you striving for excellence in school? Someday your job might depend upon how well you prepared in school, and someday your family might depend upon whether you have a job or not. Are you striving for excellence, or are you just playing around? Are you taking a job outside of school, right? Or if you're out of school, are you striving to do excellent work in your job? Are you taking on harder things and challenging yourself? Third thing, focus on others more than yourself, okay? This might be indispensable for some of you. Guys, if you have a conversation with a girl and for half an hour talk about the high score you got on some video game I don't know the name of, then that's the end, right? That's the end of that possibility. So think about the person, care about them, and ask questions of them. You guys taking notes, right? Okay. Learn from other people who are married. If someone around you has a great spouse, talk to them. Get wisdom from them. How did that happen, right? What do you recommend for me? What should I do? What should I change in my life? Read a book on marriage. Read a book on relationships. We take years of our life and devote them to getting ready for a job, but we don't spend any time very often getting ready for marriage. Read something. Think about it. Pray about this. Take seriously your walk with God, because your family will one day be shaped by how you commune with God. Your kids will one day need your knowledge of the Bible for them to learn. And then last, pray for your future spouse. Pray for what you want. If you want a spouse as a good desire, pray for that. Ask him to bless you. Ask him to bring along that right person. You can't control the future, but you can take care of what you have right now and work hard and try to become a better person that honors God and is ready for that person when they come. And by the way, we have been doing a lot of videos on the YouTube page about singleness, dating, all these things. So if you want to think more about this, check those out and be built up even more than you currently have been. So we see in the first two verses that marriage is the norm. It's a great gift to us. But singleness is also a great thing. And ultimately, sex is not a defining thing. It's not as important as you might think. That's the first thing. Sex is not as important as you think. But the second thing is that sex is better than you think. Sex is better than you think. So sex doesn't define us. It's not like you can't live a fulfilled life without being sexually active. But the purpose of sex in marriage is much better than you might even think. Verse 3, he says, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. This is a great verse, right? Some of you just found a new life verse in verse 3. Some of the men are underlining for the first time. So the verse literally says, this is what it literally says, the husband should give give his wife what is owed, and likewise the wife to her husband. So the husband should give his wife what is owed. That's the kind of literal rendering. So the interpolation here from the interpreter is good, right? He's saying, well, I'm going to read into that. He's talking about conjugal rights, talking about sexual intimacy. Because what is owed in the marriage context? What is owed in the covenant of marriage? Well, there are a lot of things. There are certain expectations and commitments that married couples have to each other, like relational intimacy, right? Part of being married is that you owe to your spouse to spend time with them, to care about them, to try to meet their emotional needs. You owe them financial support. You're not two different people with two different bank accounts or two different financial realities. You are one. And so, of course, you take care of each other. But in the context here, the main thing he's focusing on is sexual intimacy. That is something that is owed to your partner. Just like Paul doesn't allow for an unmarried life where there is sexual activity, here he doesn't allow for a married life where there's not sexual activity. You're called in marriage to care for each other in this way. So this verse is saying that it's important for husbands and wives to have regular sexual intimacy with each other. And this whole section of verses 3 through 5 is focused on promoting that regular sexual union within marriage. This is a good thing. It's actually an essential thing. Now, the key word in this verse is the verb, give. Give. Let the husband give to his wife what she is owed, and the wife give to her husband. It doesn't say the husband should get his conjugal rights from his wife, and the wife should get her rights from the husband. It doesn't say that in marriage we should become debt collectors, right? Imposing on each other and demanding that we get what is owed to us. No, it says give. And this is important for the posture of marriage. Yes, there are commitments, there are things that we owe to each other, but the posture in marriage should be one of freely giving, not of demanding and getting. And marriage really is primarily not about getting, but about giving to each other. And one of the most profound ways that we are able to give to each other in marriage is through sexual intimacy. You can give something to your spouse that no one else can. That's profound. And they're attached to you until one of you dies. That's an important thing, right? So we should give and bless each other. Jesus said in Acts 20:35, he said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. It's more blessed to give than to receive. God made us not just to be takers, but to be blessers of others. That we give good gifts to those around us in order to build them up. To take from what we have and to impact others' lives. And where is this more true than in marriage? Husbands and wives, you hold so much over your spouse. No one has the ability to bless your spouse more than you do. And I mean that at almost every area of life. The words you speak, the way you treat them, and yes, even sexual intimacy. There's incredible joy, Jesus says, in blessing your spouse and giving to others. You will receive more joy as you give to the one that you love. So husbands, are you giving your wife what is owed to her? Are you giving to your wife? Are you paying attention to her needs? Are you caring for her in a way that speaks to her as an individual, for who she is? Do you know what makes your wife feel loved and valued? Are you carving out time for her and what's important for her? Or are you letting other things like work get in the way of the most important relationship that you have? How are you doing with your wife and blessing her? Wives, are you giving your husband what is owed to him? Is he a priority to you? When was the last time you asked your husband what he wants so you could bless him? When he shares what matters to him, does that become a priority for you? Or do you let other things like kids or friendships or busyness get in the way of the most important relationship that you have? Let's take an inventory of our own lives and think about this if we're married. And it's practically a universal truth in marriage that two people are going to be on two different pages in every kind of way. Right? This is a reality. And this can be very frustrating that we have different desires, different wants, different schedules, whatever it might be. But this is part of the way that God has chosen to make us better people, to bless us, to strengthen us. Marriage forces us to become a better person by thinking not about ourselves, but about the other person. And there's a sense in which it's really impossible to have happiness and joy in marriage until you learn to think about and care about them more than yourself. So God has designed sexuality and our desires to make us godly, to force us to think about how we can care for the other person and not just get what we want. In other words, sex is much better than you think. It's not just about physical pleasure, it's about making you a godly person. It's about shaping you to be like Jesus. We'll see more of this. Look at verse 4. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. At the very first wedding in the Bible, Genesis 2, God says clearly that two people are becoming one flesh. Two become one flesh. And Paul quoted that verse in the passage we saw last week. Marriage is about two becoming one. So there's a union of two people into one common interest. We're intimately and forever united together. So Paul says, essentially, your body is not your body. You don't have full authority over your own body. This means that you don't have the right to use your body however you want. So we have to understand that we belong to somebody else. Now, of course, the caution here, and I'm sure many of you have already, just in reading this, have felt some sort of anxiety pop up. Because, of course, this verse could be terribly abused. This is not an excuse in any way. It's not an endorsement in any way for sexual abuse. This is not an endorsement for misusing a person or for coercing somebody to do things that you want to do that they don't want to do. Remember the giving principle, right? This is about freely loving and caring for your spouse. It's not about someone demanding something of you or forcing you to do something. So this is not about sexual abuse. This is not what he's saying. What he is saying is pretty amazing. He says first, the husband has authority over his wife's body. And in that culture, they would have probably said, yeah, of course, The husband's in charge. The husband gets to do whatever he wants to do. But then he says that the husband doesn't have authority over his body, but the wife does. In other words, it goes both ways. No one can say, I am my own, I can do whatever I want. No, your focus should be on giving to your spouse and caring for them because you belong to each other. So this shows us in this passage that first, that man and woman are both equal partners in the bedroom. Right? That we come together not because one has power over the other, but each has freedom and even the right to be intimate and to seek intimacy. Second, it reminds us that sex in marriage is not optional, right? You need to be intimate regularly. And then it shows us that treating our spouses with kindness and care is essential to a healthy marriage. In Ephesians 5:28, Paul says it this way. He says, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. I love that thinking, right? If you're one flesh, if you're united, then your caring for your spouse is, in a sense, just caring for yourself. You're on the same team. You're together. You depend on each other. So, of course, you should give freely because as you give, you'll also be blessed and you'll receive. This is how marriage is designed to work. Verse 5, he says, do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a limited time that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I love the mention of Satan here. It's really strange. It's kind of jarring to me as I read it. But there are many people who would be very spiritual and would say we need to love God and we need to fight against Satan and his temptations, right? But Paul reminds them here that one of the ways you can fight the devil is by having sex with your spouse, right? If you want to be spiritual, if you want to resist temptation, then you should be intimate with your spouse. Satan loves to destroy what's good. He loves destroying what is good, and one of the best things in the world is a healthy marriage. So Satan wants to come between couples, divide them apart, drive a wedge between them. And so it's important to regularly renew that covenant by coming together. So he says do not deprive one another. Do not deprive one another. What does that mean? We've seen that in marriage, we're called to give to one another, right? And of course, the sexual intimacy is in view here. That should be a regular pattern. But what does that mean? And maybe some of you want some more specifics, right? Well, what kind of frequency does that look like? How should we prioritize that? And of course, two partners in marriage are going to have different views on what that looks like. Here, the Bible doesn't give us a rule. And that's intentional, I believe, because every couple is supposed to come together to communicate to care about each other, to express their desires, and then to land on the same page, to decide what that should look like, to think together of how you can care for and meet the needs of your husband or your wife. And that requires open communication and trust. And I would say this, because the stereotype, of course, is that men have a stronger sex drive than women, okay? This is not always true, but it is often true, I should say. I would say this, men, don't let a strong sex drive be an excuse for a heavy hand in marriage, for not being gentle and caring with your spouse. Don't let that be an excuse. Don't let this, it's talking about self-control. If we sin, if we fail, that's on us. That is. So express that to your spouse. Express if you have certain needs or desires, but don't let this be an excuse for you to crush the spirit of your spouse. Don't do that. I think that's often a mistake that we made. As the leader in the relationship, man, it's important that you be gentle and loving toward your spouse. I can't stress that enough. So the basic command here is not to deprive each other, to think about the other person's need, to care for them, and to prioritize them in the relationship. And this is a way that we guard ourselves against temptation. Now, there's an exception given. There's a time to break that regular pattern of intimacy. Did you catch it in this verse? The time to do that is for prayer. There may be a time where you are fasting, in a sense, from sexual intimacy in order to devote yourself to God. And I love this because the one acceptance that Paul gives, the one time it's acceptable to distance yourself from your spouse and to break that pattern, is for God. It's not for your relationship to, I don't know, your boss, right? My boss needs me to work all these hours or go on all these trips, so I'm sorry, I'm going to neglect our relationship. That's not acceptable. It's not your relationship with your friends, right? Your friends want to hang out, you want to do things, and you're going to neglect your spouse. That's not an allowance here. It's not even for your kids. As important as they are, as much as you want to bless and raise great kids, your relationship with your spouse comes before all of them. All of them except for God himself. So prioritize this, right? Sex in marriage is about more than just pleasure. It's God's way of strengthening our relationship with our spouse. It's his way of making us into better people. It's his way of helping us think about our wife or our husband more than ourselves. It's how God shapes us in holiness. It makes us holy people. Sex is better than most of us think. And then the third and last thing we see is that sex doesn't complete you. Sex doesn't complete you. So Paul goes from starting on this note to then kind of ending on this note in this section. And he speaks to a few different situations that are outside of that normal pattern of marriage. Again, when I say normal pattern, I'm not saying it's bad at all to be single. I'm saying that's the normal expectation, and of course there's great reasons to live in singleness. Look at what he says in verse 6. He says, "Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish all were as myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another." So don't miss this. Again, in a culture that idolizes sexuality so much, Paul is saying, I wish you were all single like me. And he's going to build on this later and explain why it's so valuable to be single in the way that you can serve God. He's saying sex doesn't complete you. These relationships don't complete you. Only God can do that. Marriage is a gift, but also singleness is a gift. Both states of life are an opportunity to serve God in different ways. If you're single, you can devote yourself to serving the Lord. You can do certain things that might be dangerous or unwise for a married person because he's thinking of someone else. You can do things that married people can't do. But if you're married, you have an opportunity to serve someone in a special way that no one else can. You're called to honor God by serving your spouse. So both are a gift from God. Verse 8, he says, "To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." So he speaks to the unmarried, those are just generally those who aren't married, and to the widows, right, those who have lost a spouse. And it's specific to women because women back then lost spouses a lot more because men married at an older age and they had things like war and physical labor that would tend to kill them off. So he's speaking to widows here in particular, but he's saying it's acceptable and wonderful to not get remarried. It's a good thing. But the question in all this should be, am I honoring God? He's saying if you're burning with passion, if you really desire that, it's going to tempt you, then of course get married. God will bless you in that. The question is, am I honoring God? So we see so much here about how God views sexuality. Sexuality is a good gift from God that He's given to us to bless us, to strengthen us, to show us ultimately who He is. And so as we end here, I want us to think about what marriage and sexuality are ultimately about. All of this, is this just kind of practical advice from Paul, or does this have a greater purpose? And marriage, like every great gift we're given, is given to us to teach us about who God is and to show us what Jesus Christ has done for us. That's why God has given to us marriage and sexuality. Look at Ephesians 5:31. I'll read this for you. Ephesians 5:31, Paul says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. So Paul here again quotes from Genesis 2:24, the first wedding, about two becoming one flesh. And he says this mystery is a mystery about Christ and his church. In other words, the union of two in one isn't just about making us happy. The union of two into one isn't just about making us better people or giving us a great foundation for raising kids. The union of two into one in marriage is a pointer, a picture of God and the church. It's about the story of redemption. It's about a God who is so loving and so patient that He would pursue us in history. That Jesus Christ saw a bride that He wanted, His church, His people, and He loved us so much that He paid the greatest price possible. He laid down His life for us. He did for us what we could never do for ourselves. He cleansed us of our sins. He made us pure so He could bring us into a perfect relationship with Him. And so that one day He could make us new by overcoming death and welcoming us into a new and perfect world. That's what marriage is all about. That's why God has given to us marriage, so we could see something in our lives that resembles that pursuit that God has for us, that love that He has for us. Does your marriage model the pursuit of the Savior for His people? Does your marriage resemble His gentleness and His love? Does your marriage reflect the goodness and grace of the good news of Jesus Christ? And maybe you're saying, well, no, my marriage is messed up, and the problem is me, right? I have problems. What do I do with that? Well, of course, we all fall short of that standard, and that's why we need the good news of Jesus to remind us that He loves us, that there's grace and forgiveness at the cross of Jesus, that our lives don't ultimately depend upon our own strength or upon what we have done or our will to improve our marriages, but they depend on God's grace working in us, forgiving us and making us new day by day. So my encouragement as we close is that you would turn again to Him, that you would turn to God. If your marriage is broken, if you're in need, if you're feeling the weight of that right now, confess your own sins, confess your failings. Look to Him, look to the one who has sought you throughout history to rescue you from your sin, and ask for His grace to do a mighty work in your heart, to make you new, to bless your marriage, and to draw you closer to Him. God loves to help us when we're weak, so cry out to Him.